Welcome everyone to episode 32 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. I, of course, am your host, Janice Case, and I'm joined today once again by the wonderful Melissa Ellis and the wonderful Henri Williams, who are back with us this morning as we continue our conversation around Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. We are going to start this morning, though, with some things happening in the world around us. Our goal, of course, to contextualize everything that we've been learning together as we've made this deep dive into this book. And there is just so much going on in the world around us. So we felt like it made sense and we felt compelled to talk about a couple of things and as I said, contextualize the learning. So Henri, I know you are queued up and ready to go to get us started.
Yeah, so as I was saying, and again, I don't mean this in the true sense of the word's meaning fabulous, but it has been for me, a very interesting week in terms of the multiple demonstrations of what Kendi talks about in his book and what we're going to talk about. To include, I saw a Zoom interview with him this week. Yeah. He was visiting SUNY Albany. And so part of what I think ties into today, what we'll discuss today, is something he said during that discussion and just resonated with me also. And it's this whole idea of, and I hope I don't missay this, what he was saying, Black people can't change white people's racism. And, you know, he made this point that, I'll put it in the context of our families.
Yeah.
You would have more success addressing the racism in the Curcio family than I would.
Sure.
Versus I would have more success addressing the racism on my Williams side of family than you would.
Yeah.
And that's just a fact, and I know it's true because I felt it.
I agree.
And so with thinking about that, I thought, yeah. And then again, this week, there's just been so many examples, but I'm going to just play a clip that I've put together that will, I think, touch on what I'm saying and today's discussion, which is about color.
Okay.
All right. So let's go.
Driver of the vehicle or the vehicle itself refused to stop, which resulted in a low speed pursuit.
One thing led to another, but once police caught him, oh hell no! I seen a white truck, an officer latched on trying to get him out, and then all of a sudden we just see that the officer still on there and the vehicle trying to back into two police cars trying to get out.
Police say Sigmund's arm was stuck in the driver's window. Sigmund then pulled out his emergency rescue hammer to try and free his arm.
But then somehow, during that struggle, the suspect was able to get that hammer.
Police say Olchenbruns repeatedly struck Sigmund on the head. Other officers were finally able to move in and arrest Olchenbruns, and Sigmund was rushed to the hospital.
I'm serving this country, and this is how I'm treated. What's going on? What's going on? I'm sorry, what? Get in the car now! What's going on? Get in the car! Sir, just get out the car! Work with us and we'll talk to you. Get out the car! You received an order, obey it!
Okay.
All right. So what I'm recorded and I'm going to send to you was 3 clips.
Okay.
All right. The first clip was Pat Robertson, who we all know. You probably heard part of that. And he's just basically taking this position that this needs to stop. You know, this violence on Black people by the police.
Right.
just literally needs to stop. And so just as an example, and then the next clip I played was there was this incident where a white gentleman was going to be pulled over. He didn't stop. When the police did accost him, the policeman's arm gets caught in the window. The police officer pulls out, I guess, one of these kind of hammers to try to shatter the glass. This white gentleman gets the hammer, is hammering the police officer in the head, and then literally tries to back up into some other officers. And then they finally arrest him. And then the last clip I'll send you, as we all know, was the lieutenant in the Army driving in Virginia, who is pulled over, and I'm quite sure a lot of people have seen this, where he is demanded to get out of the car. He did nothing wrong. He was pepper sprayed. I have to admit to you folks, in most of our discussions this week, and videos and clips I've sent you, this one touched home more than anything I have ever seen or heard for several reasons. And I'm going to apologize up front because part of what I'm going to say sounds stereotypical of things we've talked about, but he demonstrated what Kendi and we've talked about in this book is you try to get to that point where I am just as good. He was well spoken. He's a lieutenant, an officer in the military. He, if you listen to the exchange in the video, he was not loud. He was not aggressive. He was accommodating. His hands were outside the window. And yet he was treated in such a way that, from what I understand, at least one of the officers was terminated, and they both should be. All of them should have been. Yeah. But I cannot, and I said this to Joan, that could be me. I could be driving to Virginia, visiting some of my folks down there, and get pulled over. And how is that not me? Because he did nothing. I just don't, and then I listened to Pat Robertson and then what Kendi said. And we've been saying this for years. As a person of color, this is not new to us.
Right.
And so if this is going to stop, it's going to take white people, the good white people who literally are in a position to do something about this. I'm not subjecting or saying I don't or people of color don't play a role or a part, but literally, this is not going to change unless people make some sense or a commitment to make a change.
Yeah.
And the reason that I agree with you wholeheartedly is because of what you said. It's not that we don't play a part, it's that we've been playing our part. We've been saying this, we've been begging, we've been pleading, we've been shining light, we've been recording, we've been releasing videos, we've been calling, for this kind of change. I don't know what more we can do, because what we're doing is not having an impact. We're being dismissed, we're being ignored, we're being, called liars, or we're being, our histories and our pasts are being picked apart to find reasons to justify this behavior. The other thing you said, Henri, that really sticks out to me is you said, that could be me because he did nothing wrong. In so many of these cases, they did nothing wrong. Yeah. Or what's perceived as wrong is simply being a human, being afraid, being angry, speaking loudly does not justify police brutality. That is what we have been saying from the start. No one wants to hear that. It is so much easier to just say, oh, but he was a criminal. Oh, but he did this back in the day. What he did yesterday has absolutely nothing to do with his interaction with that police in that moment. And if those police officers don't know his past, which they don't, 9 times out of 10 when they're dealing with anybody, they don't have your criminal record pulled up to know that, to make an assumption of what kind of person you are. That has no bearing whatsoever. But when it comes to Black people, we are so quick to want to find what it is they did that justifies what the police officer did, instead of accepting and admitting that they didn't, that the officer did wrong.
The thing that just angers me the most, and when Joan and I watched this, the 21-year-old who was pulled over for a minor misdemeanor warrant.
Yeah,
and the officer supposedly thought she had her taser and literally shot him in the chest. And then you juxtapose that against this white gentleman that was not shot, was not tased or anything.
And he's assaulting an officer.
And he's assaulting an officer and planning to cause more assault to other officers. And how do you dismiss? This doesn't happen unless you're Black or you're not. Or the color of your skin, literally.
And there's so many cases of it though. Like there's so many. Kyle Rittenhouse, prime example, young boy walking around with a rifle in a crowd of people, past police officers who did absolutely nothing, who saw him, knew he had a weapon, did nothing, against the Daunte Wright who's standing there terrified, you know, or Tamir Rice who has a plague gun. And it's so many examples. So a cop can't recognize her own gun from a taser, but a 13-year-old gets killed. Tamir Rice, I don't even think he was 13, I think he was 11. I'm confusing them. Adam was 13.
Right.
Tamir was 11. An 11-year-old can't play with a toy gun outside in a park without getting murdered. And
but see,
and I want to
take this back and why it really impacted me differently. And this is really about his chapter. This is about color. And literally, I agree with you. None of them deserve this, you know, but there was always some provocation. Oh, he had a warrant. Oh, he sped through this. In this lieutenant's case, there was nothing. You know, there wasn't anything. There wasn't a warrant. And this is really about you work to achieve to be that person that you think is going to be okay. You know, I do the right thing. I go to school. I'm a fucking lieutenant in the military, and yet I still get treated like this. That's why I think this is so different, you know. This isn't a 13-year-old in the alley. Did he have a gun or did he not have a gun? And you know, there's the video where his hands are up, you know. This is literally that whole story where you talk about you work so hard to be that person where you think, I'm gonna be separated from this, and yet you are not.
But I think that's the problem though, Henri. I think that's a big part of the problem. I don't think anybody should have to be separate. Nobody should have to be perfect to be
agree with you. I agree with you. I agree with you. But this was an example of even when you do that, it doesn't matter.
Well, because, you know, to jump in really quickly, Melissa, like you said, nobody should have to. And the example that you're offering, Henri, the officer who was pepper sprayed, it made me, as I watched it, it made me feel like every effort is futile, right? Like if you, like you said, if you do everything in a certain way, and notice I'm not saying the right way, in a certain way, in order to hopefully dispel the fears of the person on the other side, hopefully get them to see you as a person, Melissa, to your point, versus first and foremost by the color of your skin, and then all the misconceptions that come with that. you can still be treated, as you said, Henri, a certain way. And it makes it, you know, I'm a white woman, and yet I'm watching this video thinking it feels futile, right? Like, what the hell do you do if you
I
do
think
everything else?
I think I guess then, Janice, I guess this is one of those situations where we all are on different levels, because I got to that point with Trayvon Martin, a 16-year-old boy walking home from a store
Agreed.
who did
Agreed.
nothing, had no kind of record. He did nothing.
Yeah.
So he was proof to me that no matter what you do, you're in your own neighborhood, walking down the street. Ahmaud Arbery is proof of that. Like, we've got so many. I hear you guys. I really do. That this is a prime example of it. I guess the point I'm making is it's not the first example of it.
I got you. Yep.
There are so many examples of it.
Yeah.
And it's scary, because there is this idea of respectability respectability politics, where there's so many people striving for that. And I'm tired of striving for that. I'm a human. I'm gonna make mistakes. People are gonna do the wrong thing. It's still, I don't care what, it's still like I saw a meme that said, cops don't even have the right to kill you if you're guilty. I don't care if you see me standing there and I just choked a woman, and I'm standing there with no weapon. You have no right to kill me.
Right.
You have the right to arrest me. You have the right to take me to trial. You don't have the right to kill me. And that's what they're doing repeatedly, over and over and over. And it's infuriating. And to see the case with the lieutenant, absolutely infuriating. But for me, and I can only speak for me, no more so than it was to see George Floyd, no more so than it was to see Tamir Rice, no more so than Devontae Wright or Adam Toledo, or I could go on and on. Breonna Taylor sleeping in her bed. How much less provocation do you need?
Yeah.
Like, it's ridiculous.
No, and you know, and I agree with you. I guess the point I was trying to make is every one of those examples is correct. It's just personal resonate.
Yes, I get it. I do.
A personal resonation.
Yes.
And I'm going to tell you why. 2 summers ago, I'm driving to New Hampshire to our cabin. You know where our cabin is, Janice. And I'm speeding. It's midnight. I get pulled over by an officer. And he stops me on the side of the road. He's white, obviously. I'm up in New Hampshire. And you know, he goes through his thing, and but it ended well, you know, with, you know, don't speed. You know, I worked for a drinking driver pro in California, so I knew he was going through all the things, trying to see if you smell like liquor. I don't drink and drive, so I wasn't really worried about that. What was fascinating, as we pull off, my daughter, Phelan, my oldest daughter, says, "Dad, I was scared to death."
Yeah.
And so that's why it resonated with me.
And I really want to say, I don't want to take away from your personal connection to it. That wasn't my intention, because I feel you. That's what Trayvon Martin was to me. So I apologize if it came off that way. That wasn't my point. I just kind of wanted the listeners to understand that that's one example that we've seen of several. That's all.
But Melissa, both of your points are well taken, and it is, we all do have our own set of experiences that we bring to the table. So it's not, I guess, a surprise that a different story, right? One story kind of grabs you in one way because of your own context. That's not a surprise at all. But I am sitting here, excuse me, a little bit worried that not a little bit worried, kind of acknowledging it once again, that Henri, you said this earlier, and it's true, and it sits with us. Every time this happens, the first thing that we do, however you define we, is look for justification. Actually, Melissa, I think you said it, of why, right? Well, he may have had a gun. Oh, he had a gun that looked like, he had a toy gun that looked like a gun. Oh, he had a warrant out for this thing. Oh, he whatever. And we have to be constantly reminded that regardless of those things, right? Regardless of those things, any justification, and Melissa, you said it well when you just said, even if you just watched me choke a woman and I'm standing there without a weapon, you still only have the right to arrest me. And
Right.
so even with, Dante Wright and, okay, there was this little warrant out, that little warrant out. None of those things in that moment in time was risking someone's life. None of
That's
those
right.
things was putting somebody else in danger.
Yeah, if
And
I'm
so
a
at what
white
point did
man,
we,
I could hit you with a hammer in the
Right.
head and nothing
exactly,
will happen.
exactly. That's
Exactly.
exactly my point. And so in my mind, and why aren't we, I don't understand why we wouldn't in that moment then be trained to step away, right? If you feel like your life is in danger, why aren't we being trained to step back? If the worst thing that happens is Dante Wright drives off in his truck, guess what? We know who he is. We know where he
That's right.
lives.
That's
We know,
exactly.
like, then why isn't the response to step back, right? If the
That's right.
choice is hurt somebody else or not, why aren't we stepping back? And I don't want to, I'm being really careful because who knows who listens, right? And I would never say all cops are bad, because they're not. But it goes back to Kendi's, all that we've been talking about. Kendi keeps coming back to, there's an individual responsibility, of course, that contributes to this, but we can't overlook the power of the system. We
That's
can't
right.
overlook the power of the system, which is going to lead us into this conversation around color this week, because once again, right, coming to this idea of, when you think about how we perceive people all around us constantly, so much of it is tied to their color. And now, of course, it's like, it's not just that they're black or white, it's what
Light or dark.
shade of color they are, and all the messaging. And it honestly, it just makes me so angry when he drills all the way down historically, and you realize the messaging started from, people who didn't know anything, but they started putting it out there, and it got backed up so strongly across time that intrinsically it's believed. And so therefore, even our actions today in this moment reflect these random qualities that people 200 years ago put on other people because of, for their own purposes, right? For their own gain,
benefit.
for
Yeah.
their own gain.
Well, and his chapter, what I thought was fascinating, and I don't know, I'm a little older than you, Melissa, so I don't know if what I experienced continued in your generation. But he talks about this pursuit of being white.
Yeah.
I'll put it that way. And so it's described I put in orange eyes or light colored eyes,
Mhm.
I straighten my hair.
Yep.
And it could expand to how you dress, who you associate with, and it was just so fascinating, because that's kind of what I was, I'm seeing this correlation here where,
Yeah.
even when you strive to do those things, at the end of the day,
Still doesn't.
it doesn't undo the racism.
Nope. And it did continue in my generation. It is just now, I think, in the recent generation, like now you're starting to, it's funny, Henri, because it's like this vicious circle that never connects, because we start to unravel. Like, we went from Black is beautiful, raised fists and Black empowerment, to respectability politics, where everybody was behave a certain way and act. And now I see the awakening a bit more. I'm probably a physical representation of it right now today.
Yeah.
I purposely wear head wraps. I have an allegiance to certain colors. I do certain things to represent my pride in being Black. And so I see it kind of coming back around, but it never fully connects before something happens to detract us from it. And we fall for the fake beauty standards and all of that all over again. But it's funny, because the honey eyes, or the orange eyes, like you said, I think he called it. I went through, I never did it, thank God. But I really wanted for a really long time. Like, I wanted these light eyes. And I was just like, oh, I just think I'll look cute. The part that resonated with me, Henri, and it's interesting, I wonder if it did for you, was that I wasn't consciously trying to be white. In my head, I wasn't thinking, I want to be white. I want to be, I just wanted to be pretty, what I thought was pretty. And when he said that about the eyes, like here he is rocking cornrows, which is rebellion, and these light eyes, which is assimilation, all on the same body. It really struck home for me because, you know, that is something that we battle with. And I think the other, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, eyes weren't my thing, you know, and so I'm so grateful for James Brown, and I'm gonna tell you why. So I kind of grew up on that cusp, and I was thinking about this morning, you know, 1965 Civil Rights Act, you know, I was what, 10, 11. So I had one foot in the Concoline era, where you know, men straightened their hair, and you know, literally got the lie and the whole bit. And then post 65, 68, I'm Black and I'm proud, and here's comes the Afro. So I, in a way, had this one foot in, because I remember that, you know, my cousin, let's get our hair straightened. And I probably did it once or twice. But then here comes I'm Black and I'm proud. And you could see in my high school graduation picture, I had an afro like this. So I think I didn't get so much into that because I grew up at that, you know, 68 and this Black Panther, Black Pride kind of piece where it didn't really catch hold of me, but I certainly seen it, you know, and saw it in other generations. And like you, probably when I was older as an adult, and I see people get these eyes, and I was kind of, oh man, that's interesting. And, you know, I wonder how that would look, but I never really did it, you know, but I don't think, like you said, I consciously thought about wanting to be white more than this unconscious standard, you know, that you're trying to somehow work towards, and just to maybe fit in, get along.
Right.
I want to really quickly go back to the definitions so that we're, you know, our listeners can kind of get that out of the gate. So Kendi uses the word colorism, which he later tells us was coined by Alice Walker. So she's the person who actually coined it, but a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequities between light people and dark people, supported by racist ideas about light and dark people. Like, or then counter to that, of course, color anti-racism would be a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to equity between light people and dark people. So supported, of course, then by anti-racist ideas about light and dark people. And he says early on, Melissa, right after he talks about, you guys are both talking about, again, his dueling consciousness of kind of one foot in the cornrows and the other foot in, you know, the eyes and the assimilation piece. But he says that this post-racial beauty ideal is lightness, the race of lighter skin and eyes, straighter hair, thinner noses, and semi-thick lips and buttocks perceived as biracial or racially ambiguous. But the thing that he says that I think is so important right there in the beginning, and I sat there kind of going, okay, yeah, let's ask that question. And he said, why? The question I never asked myself, like both of you, he said, I wasn't consciously trying to be white. I was trying to, I thought I would like how I looked with these things, right? The lighter eyes, the straight hair, etc. And he says, but I never stopped to ask myself the anti-racist question, which we've asked ourselves a lot over these first 8 chapters. And that's why. Why did I think lighter eyes were more attractive on me? What did I truly want? And that's when he then goes into this idea that we've established a European ideal, right? And now I would say, not necessarily consciously, right? We're not overtly saying to the world right now, white is beautiful, everybody should try to be white. But it was pretty overt, right? A couple of 100 years ago, and it's not gone anywhere. There's still that striving. And even you guys know this, even within the context of white, there's the ideal, right? That women especially, but are constantly striving for, even within the context of that. But the simple act of asking that question, like, why did I want, like you said, Melissa, I felt like it would be pretty. I thought that would be pretty, right? But he makes us dig deeper than that and says, yeah, but why? Like, why did you think that would be pretty, right? And I was just like, oh my God, blown away again. Like, son of a, like, you're right. That's okay. Where did that come from?
But you know what's funny, Janice, is that's there's still examples of that today. It's evolving currently. Like this isn't just based on, while it did originate, with years and years and years ago, there's this current and constant idea that what white people think is best is best. And I'll give you a classic example. Black women with big lips, or Black people with big lips,
Yeah.
were ridiculed for years, centuries, ridiculed. Our lips were just unusual. You saw it turned into caricatures in art, back in Jim Crow era and all of that. And today, white women are injecting collagen in their lips to get bigger lips. And now all of a sudden, that's beauty.
That's exactly.
I am a walking, talking example of a woman who has had a big butt since diapers. I think I have had one of the biggest butts most people have ever seen, no lie. And it was a source of shame and embarrassment for me my entire life. I struggled. That's one of the reasons I became overweight. That's one of the reasons, like, it was trying to get just now, because Kim Kardashian had one. Women are running to get butt implants to have the butt that most Black women have carried their entire lives and been ridiculed for.
Yeah.
And it's like the minute, cornrows, hairstyles, for example, Black hairstyles, braids and cornrows were considered ghetto. They were unprofessional. We couldn't wear them in the workplace. We couldn't wear them in the military. They were just not accepted. All of a sudden, because white women start wearing cornrows and braids, now all of a sudden they're a fashion statement, they're a trend. And it's that kind of frustration, but it's that drives Black people to say, yeah, no, white isn't everything. Like, what in the world? That was us. That's mine. That we did that. We created that. We wore that. We were born with that. And it was not good enough for you. And now, because you want it, it's this wonderful, beautiful thing. And now, and even so, though, it's really mostly wonderful and beautiful when you do it. It's still not wonderful and beautiful when I do it. I still get called unprofessional for wearing braids. I still get called, ghetto for having color in my hair, but you don't. And so that's the stuff I don't think people consciously think about. Like you said, the why. Why is it that all of a sudden big lips are popular? Why is it that all of a sudden big butts are the dream? Why is it that these hairstyles are now okay in certain situations? And it's because of that. It's because in our minds, subconsciously or otherwise, we have this idea that if it's endorsed by whiteness, then it's okay.
Yeah. And Melissa, I think what's important about what you're saying is that he does give the history, and like we've done all along, we encourage people to go back and read themselves, obviously, because I'm not going to go through the long history, but he maps the picture all the way back to the late 70s, all the way up. But so you have the kind of the stuff that won't surprise you, but will make you angry when you realize how subjective it is. Right. But then he does map it all the way up into today. Like you said, he's and he's like, don't think it's gone, right? Even because just because we're now deciding to lift up some beauty ideals that are linked more toward Black people or African American people, that doesn't mean that it's gone. And and I'm going to come right to you, Henri, after this. He talks about, like, as recent as 2007, a particular newscaster's comparisons with two basketball teams, those, nappy-headed hoes there to those light people over here. Oh, they all look cute, right? He gives examples of, screen calls for Straight Outta Compton, and how very specifically it was, if you're going to be these characters, you have to be this light. If you're going to be these characters, so it's not gone. And it absolutely contributes to, our kind of day-to-day perceptions, what we walk around with and thinking, this must be good, this must be bad, right? And I'm going to come back to that in a minute about those perceptions. But Henri, I want to come to you.
Oh, no. I was just going to say, this whole idea of color and the history, because I remember growing up and you hear this thing about the house, field, and yard and Negro, I'll call it. Yeah. And and he kind of describes it perfectly in the book as I heard it in my family. you know. So, you know, the house Negro was fair, light skin. And as you got closer to the field, you got darker and darker, where the darkest person was the person working out in the field.
Yep.
And just to kind of show you how this interestingly doesn't change. And I admit, I sometimes, I don't know if I'm conscious, but I certainly do look. So we get Land's End, you know, the magazines.
Yeah.
And I've noticed now, oh, so they make an effort of including models that look like Phelan, but not Jamie.
Yep.
You
And
don't know my daughters,
know.
Melissa. If you know my daughters, you'd know exactly what I'm talking about. They range the spectrum of color, where, you know, my older daughters have often been, oh, who are you? Where are you from? You know, because of their fair skin, where Jamie is dark. And so you still see that effect in advertising, you know. So here I'm looking at Land's End, and, you know, they're doing the bathing suits, but you don't see dark-skinned women.
Yep. That's exactly right. So that's Henri, seriously, that's a great example of, you know, and it's like, on one hand, you're kind of like, all right, well, at least we're making steps in that direction. But it's like, oh my gosh, do they have to be baby steps, right? Do we have to fall into that that behavior, right, that supports colorism, if you will? And he does. Here's why it's really important. Even something as simple, I think you can call it simple, as the color of the models they choose for a particular catalog, right? Why it's important is that he talks about how anti-dark colorism is intrinsically tied to then the logic of behavioral racism, linking behavior to color, right? So that's it. For me, I feel like that's the really kind of dangerous, scary part that we have to be really upfront about, is that it's the tie of colorism to behaviorism that makes you realize that's been the leap that people make to, oh, if you're that color, then you are like ... right? Whatever the qualifications are that you put to it. So he quotes a couple of different things. He talks about studies that show white children attribute positivity to lighter skin and negativity to darker skin at early ages because of the messaging they have. He says a colorism that grows stronger as they get older. White people usually favor lighter skinned politicians over darker skinned ones. Dark African Americans are disproportionately at risk of things like hypertension, like the medical implications of it. Dark African American students receive significantly lower GPAs than lighter students, maybe because racist Americans, he says, have higher expectations for light students. People tend to remember educated Black men as light skinned, even when their skin is dark, he says. Is that, he wonders then, why employers prefer light Black men over dark Black men, regardless of qualifications? And he even goes on to say, even dark Filipino men have lower incomes than their lighter peers here in the US. And he goes on and on, right? The list is so long. So he helps us, again, recognize that the implication, like there's serious implications of colorism being a very real thing. And if we're not overt about discussing it and putting it on the table, these are the outcomes that result, right? These are some of the outcomes, because we started this episode talking about the really terrifying outcomes, right? That not only is it now that I have to worry about not only has it always been that I have to worry about being a Black man, for example, to your point, Melissa, walking in the park or taking a run, but also the color of my darkness can have significant implications with how I may or may not be threatened by somebody else as a result of it. So those are some of the things I wanted to lift up.
Yeah, and we have to be very transparent in that this is not just something white people do. This is something that we as Black people, we talked about how we are conditioned by these things as well. This is probably what I would say one of the biggest problems the Black community has at the moment is colorism. Okay. We are quick to condemn darker Blacks ourselves. We are quick to want to hold lighter Blacks to a better, higher standard because we do think they are better in our own minds. And I say the we collectively because of course not personally, but that is an idea and a mindset, and it's one of the reasons for a great deal of division within the Black community. I've mentioned before the power of propaganda, but we do this a lot as jokes. If you're on social media at all, you'll see where there's this whole perception that light-skinned Black men are soft and weak, and they are feminine. Even they aren't men. Light-skinned Black men are not men. The darker you are, though, the more manly, the stronger, the better. And it's a real thing. And we say it jokingly, we crack jokes about it, but that is very much rooted in colorism. And it's a problem. It's a problem in how Kendi even mentioned in the book, his college girlfriend. Yep. How she was light skinned, and when he decided that, you know what, I don't know why I think the light skin is better, I'm gonna go for darker skin, his friends then started saying that he was dating down, that he started to decline, that his darker skinned girlfriends were somehow lesser than his one light skinned girlfriend that he had in college. Like every girlfriend after that, in their eyes, has been lesser than, simply because they were darker skinned. So it's a real problem, and it's something that we as Blacks are not innocent of. We do it horribly. We do it a lot.
Yeah. And I do think that was a big part of his kind of messaging, if you will, right? Like you said, it's something that everyone does. And again, which just ties to what he has said many times across all these chapters. And that is that, none of us are immune to the messaging, to the structures of the system, et cetera. None of us, and we've all, I think, been really revealing or vulnerable about our revelations as we've read and realized, like, oh, wait a second, I have thought that way. Oh, wait a second, like, and not intending, if you will, to be racist. And somewhere in here, he says something about like reminding himself that the car of racism drives just as fast, whether you intended to be racist or not, right? And I'm like, that's not right. Go ahead, Henri.
No, and you're touching on something that I actually made a note about. None of us are immune, and even within let's say the group of people of color. And, as you were talking about this, I think about, so part of my family's from the Caribbean, and I have good friends who are Puerto Ricans, and they'll clearly tell you, dark skin, light skin, they're all Puerto Rican, all speak the same language, maybe born in the same neighborhood, but based on the color of your skin, you can be treated very differently, and it's simply about the color of your skin, unfortunately, I read the book, so it's hard for me to talk about a chapter and not intertwine something that was talked about in a future chapter. But as we're talking about, none of us are immune. I'm sitting here thinking about some of the let's say Black people who are in power, who are also like, you think, and I remember early on we got into a back and forth about the Black people be racist, and he basically makes the case in future chapters where, and as he's talking about, I thought about this, and because it's about power, and so, but everybody has some sphere of influence and sphere of power, and he gave this example of Ken Bradwell, who I think was the Attorney General in Ohio during the Bush administration, who was a Black gentleman who worked very diligently to suppress the Black vote. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you not think of this person, at least endorsing racist beliefs and following through with them? My head sometimes wants to explode. Melissa, you live in South Carolina, right?
I do.
You're senator. I literally cannot wrap my head around where is he at?
Yep.
I mean, lock, stock, barrel has voted, with the Trump and all the Republican policies, and we know where they are at and where they're headed. And I'm like, so when you think about, can people of color be racist? You're damn right they can.
Well, which circling back to your point in the beginning, Henri, that it's going to take all of us, right? Like you said, I mean, you said earlier, white people, Black people can't change white people's racism. And that's 100% true. And there's a reason that there are three of us on this in this conversation, and two of you are Black and one of us is white, because we can't. It can't be a separate conversation. Now we have to, like you said, Henri, understand what audiences we can influence more. If that's what has to happen, great. But you're kind of coming back to that. We absolutely, one of the most powerful things for me so far is that every single person who has spent time in this country has racist ideas, whether you consciously or
Conscious
or
or
not.
not.
And the only way to understand that and to move forward differently is to dig into that and understand it, right? Like you have to understand it first, which is why we're doing what we're doing here, right? He says, and this is one of the pieces that this is one of the last things that I wanted to make sure that I surface for all of us. And then certainly I want to hear yours, but he basically says to be an anti-racist is to diversify our standards of beauty, like our standards of culture or intelligence or behavior, all the things we've talked to up until this point, to see beauty equally in all skin colors, broad and thin noses, kinky, straight hair, light and dark eyes. To be an anti-racist is to build and live in a beauty culture that accentuates instead of erases our natural beauty. And that, on some level, that seems so simple, except that until we catch ourselves and ask ourselves the why, like he indicated earlier in the chapter, we don't make any progress. We just keep going through the same cycles.
And until we recognize that it's not just your personal opinion that we're talking about. It's not just, I might be the type of person that is attracted to light skin or dark skin or tall or short. But when a person can't wear their natural hair to work because it's unprofessional, when a child can't walk across the stage to graduate because the hairstyle that they wear is deemed unprofessional, when it is the way the hair grows out of his head, then we're talking about much more than just your personal preferences. Exactly. We're talking about much more than just what you personally deem attractive. So it's not just the beauty standard, it's how the standard is impacting what we keep trying to focus on, the policies, the laws, the procedures, the things that actually shape our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
But there's also the ingrained beliefs that have to be undone. And as we're talking, this literally just popped into my head. So as a sports person, I watched the NCAA basketball women and men's. I don't know if any of you watched any of this. One of the most fascinating comments I got from people was, what's wrong with their hair? Okay. And go back and look at some of the games. And basically what, and this was people of color were making reference to, is these Black men and women who were just wearing their hair natural. They weren't worrying about it being straight or in a ponytail. And so when it was actually one of my cousins who said this, and I'm
wow, that's fascinating.
I said, it was very fast. I said, what are you talking about? He said, yeah, look at their hair. And it was almost that piece of, you don't look good, you look unkempt, and I said, well, no, they're just being themselves, no different than maybe when I was 15 but what it really resonated for me, because that's Jamie too, she just wears her hair anyway, is you're not just fighting, you're fighting even your own folks, who hold on to these beliefs of what you should be or what you should look like.
A very classic example of that, Henri, was Blue Ivy, Beyonce's daughter. As a young girl, Beyonce made the choice to leave her daughter's hair natural. And she would be in videos with her hair, just her hair. And Black people literally attacked this child
Yes.
appeal
Yes.
on social media, calling her exactly that word, unkept, ugly, nappy-headed. Are you
Mhm.
kidding me? She's a child, and that is the way her hair grows from her head. But because we are expected to always be on point, they wanted her hair relaxed or straightened and braided and, you know,
Mhm.
bows on it, and it had to be immaculate. As a child, it starts as children for us, you know, and
Yep.
no one was worried that these were adults coming for a kid. Like, that's how deeply ingrained it is
Yeah.
that we would even find fault with a, and I don't even think that little girl was 2. I don't even think she was a toddler yet. And we were already policing the hair that grows from her scalp. Like,
Yeah.
it is a real thing. And we did that. We
Yep.
did that, however, I need to be very clear. We did that, however, because those standards have been
Yeah.
ingrained, because we
Exactly.
have been conditioned. And it's funny because and going back to something that you said earlier, Henri, about whether Black people can be racist and the angst. I admitted to feeling in the very beginning, I felt a lot of angst at taking on the label racist. And the reason as I've been reading this book, I'm still digesting that one. I still ain't walking around saying that I am. I mean, not yet. I can see it coming, but it ain't there yet. But the reason I think, though, is because when you hear people say, well, Black people are racist, they're always talking about being racist towards whites.
Yes.
They're not talking about being racist towards other Blacks or people of color. And that's where we carry racism. That I can see that we as Black people are indeed racist when it comes to that, because we are living under the same racist conditions that everybody else in this world is living under. But I see how quickly when we take ownership of that, how quickly it gets turned towards making whites the victim. And that I don't see, well, that's not racism is not towards white people. A lot of them want it to be desperately, which is why we come up with terms like reverse racism. But the point of the matter is, in the context in which we're speaking about racism, we're speaking about the same racism that white people display towards people of color, not the opposite. And so that, when you said that earlier, I was like, absolutely, we can be racist in the same way that whites are racist, not the opposite. And I think that's the point that needed to be stated to make sure that the conversation doesn't get weaponized against us, that ownership of racism doesn't get weaponized against us, because that happens often.
Well, I think where, I've come to see the distinction is kind of what you're saying. Can a person of color be just as racist as a white person by forwarding and endorsing and supporting policies and behaviors that are harmful to people of color? Yes. And I think when I've listened to him going in the other direction, to put it this way, and I catch myself also, and it's trying to not paint everybody with the same brush. And so where for me, I need to remember, because I'll say something like this week, this has been a horrendous week, and I'll say, oh man, white people are so freaking mean. Well, not all white people are freaking mean. Not all white cops are murderers, and I'll have to catch myself, because he says in the book, when you do that, you're endorsing those same kind of global beliefs of painting everybody with the same brush. And not all white cops do this, and I have to remember that. And so when I speak, I want to be clear in my speech of not painting everybody with the same brush. And yeah, those ex-white officers in Chicago did blah, blah, blah. And the reason that he it kind of came back to me this way. And I don't know if it's in this chapter, but other chapters where he's talking about this intersect of race, color, and racism. He said, think about some of those encounters where officers abused or killed a Black person. Not all those cops were white.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, and I'm like, and when he said, I'm like, yeah, you're right. And I don't remember those Black cops say, hey, stop, fellas, let's stop this.
Yeah.
I think we said this when we first began, and maybe it's one of those definitions that needs to kind of be reiterated, but you're absolutely right. We spoke though about how when we say some things, we're speaking of the collective, simply because it's I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I will say that it's difficult to be mindful all the time to say as clearly and definitively, like you said, that the cops in Chicago or these particular cops. So at times we do speak collectively when we say white people, when we say Black people. And I think that that's one of those things we talked about earlier about understanding the meaning when you say stuff. So when we say white people, we're speaking collectively. And that does not mean when speaking collectively that we think every single person in that group fits that particular thing. It's the collective, because it's enough of it. It's the majority of it. And I think majority might even be dangerous to say, because I absolutely hear you, Henri, that it's not every single, we've been preaching that nobody's a monolith. Just like we as Black people don't want to be seen as a monolith. We're all the same. We all do the same. We don't view others that way, or we shouldn't view others that way either. What it took me to in the book, though, it made me think of when you were speaking just now, is when he spoke of overcorrecting in the book. And I think that's the result of kind of attempting to overcorrect when you say, we want so desperately for people to see that there's a problem with police brutality, that it's a lot easier to just say the police. And maybe that's overcorrecting because we're going too far and lumping everybody together. Or it's overcorrecting in the sense that we are taking the few bad and just throwing them in the pile with everybody, just letting it ruin the bunch. But it definitely made me think of overcorrecting. And it made me, again, look at myself, like, I do this often. For those who can't see me, I have on a head wrap. I always have on the colors red, black, and green, which are representative of Africa. I'm very, very pro-Black, which does not mean I am anti-white in any way. Just means that I'm very pro-Black, but I display that because I'm proud of it and I want the world to see it. But I think some may see that as overcorrection, and maybe it is. I'm okay with it if it is, I'm just saying. But some may see that as overcorrection because it is going from one extreme where I wasn't really permitted to display that or wasn't knowledgeable enough to display that, to now very deliberately and purposely displaying that every chance I get. So I think that's a part of a conversation that needs to be had as well. The fact of at least recognizing overcorrection and how it may manifest in speaking collectively and, in many different ways.
Well, and
thinking about correction.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, but thinking about what you're saying, and this kind of ties back. I don't know if it was a episode before this or 2 episodes before, and we were talking about, power, and whether one perceives having power to correct,
Right.
in situations. And so you're talking about overcorrection and this whole, I just feel there's something also important about speaking up.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. I was on a board meeting this week, and so they just legalized marijuana in New York State. And so a couple of the boards I'm on, this has become a hot discussion. One of them is the whole intersect of how we're going to effectively treat people who now have medical authorization to use marijuana, but yet they got an alcohol problem. And then they're talking about policing and drug arrests, you know. And, but it was just funny talking about overcorrection. They all of a sudden came up with this idea of, you know, this way we're going to stop people. And I forget what they called it, but basically they came up with a way to, when they pull somebody over, they can tell if whether or not you're on drugs or not. And so, but basically, because they don't have a breathalyzer for marijuana at this point in time. And so I'm listening to all this, and I finally said to somebody, so you're talking about a subjective analysis of whether or not someone is high.
Oh, my.
And oh yeah, oh literally, this is actually being discussed. And literally, and I basically had to say this to the group. And we all know what can happen if that person happens to be Black. But it's just fascinating to me that I think I was the only person of color in that meeting. Would that have come up? Would that even have been said? You know, when we talk about correction, I just feel it is so important when you're in these settings, when people are going to say silly things or things that literally do nothing more than support the continued beliefs, you know, that we know are false. There needs to be corrections, you know. And I understand sometimes it's taking a risk, you know, and as I said, going back to earlier discussions, depending on who you are, where you are. But to me, I mean, come on, folks, how do we sit there? I mean, I'm in this board meeting with this non-for-profit, and I can't believe that you folks are actually saying some of these things.
Yeah.
And I'm saying to myself, if I'm not here pushing back, what are these people believing?
So, Henri, you're making. Okay, so really quickly, if it's okay, you're making good points, and you're getting to the action part, right? And so we usually wrap up every episode by challenging people to take some action. So you just identified one of them. So Melissa, I'm going to come to you. I know you had something to say. Be thinking about your wrap up actions, because we'll kind of take our turns doing that to go to take it to the end. Go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, I was just going to say that that's a prime example, though, Henri, and you've been a champion of this from the beginning, of us being in the room.
Yep.
Us showing up for these kinds of, town halls and board meetings and any PTO, like anything that we can stand up and, be present for, because a lot of times it's not going to be put on the table if we don't put it there, or if we're not, or at least if we're not present, like at least being present, it might spark somebody to think of something, like people of color, hey, yeah. Black folks. But if there's none in the room, it's so easy to just proceed as normal without any objection, because there's, we're not present. So I just wanted to say that is exactly right. When you say we need to be there, we need to be in the room at the table, part of the discussions.
And Melissa, I'm gonna zero in on what you just said. Without you in the room, without a person of color in the room, right? We'll proceed as normal, you said. And what we are striving to help people understand with this podcast is that as normal means the way it's best for whites.
Exactly.
So you want to ensure that you're not following that as normal, right? And if that's not a good enough reason to ensure diversity in the boardroom, on boards, in the, because there's a responsibility on all of our parts to show up, Melissa. I don't disagree with that at all. But there's also a responsibility in the people who are in the system, right? At all these different levels, who are organizing to say, hold on a second, we need a person of color on this group.
Absolutely.
And we can say that now with confidence without feeling like, because there was a little bit of a, I don't know what the right word is, kind of an angst about that in the past too, because it was like, well, gosh, are we being racist by saying we need a person of color, right? By like calling that out. And the answer is no, because Henri, to your point, that's exactly right. If you don't have people with the unique lenses in the room, you cannot possibly create
That's right.
systems, create policies, create all the things, understanding within that will ensure that they serve all people, right? You can't possibly. So yes, I mean, in my mind, that's a very specific action. And to your point, Henri, for all of our listeners, that's going to be one of my actions, right? Look around and ask yourself, if there are no people of color, why is that? And what are we going to do to change that? Be the person who says out loud, hold on a second. First off, you know, even as a white woman, hopefully I'd be able to say, are we all acknowledging that if they pull that guy over and they make their subjective analysis and he's black, it's probably going to be different than if he's white, right? Like I can do that, but I can't do that the way that a person of color could do that, right? And I will miss it too. Here I am in my little world, working really hard to be as anti-racist as I know to be. And a big part of that is this process with you guys and learning through it. But it would be ridiculous of me to think that I would always think of the
Exactly.
angle. It would be ridiculous of that. Go ahead, Henri, you're having a reaction.
I am having such a strong reaction to what you just said, Janice, and this is why.
Go ahead. Please.
So the Pat Robertson piece, you know, when it came out, it was prefaced like, well, why was this so important? And they went into this thing, you know, dog bites man, man bites dog. And they said, why it was so important is you didn't expect a Pat Robertson to say what he said. Here's a white Angelico who is literally saying stuff that you expect to hear from a black person's voice.
Yep.
You know, and so what you just said, Janice, yes, in a meeting, you saying, isn't it interesting? That will have as much power or sometimes more power than me saying it.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. What I was suggesting is that I'm going to miss something, right? So it's me, it's 100% me, but it's also someone else who can make sure that we don't miss something. So I couldn't agree more with you on that point. Absolutely. So that's one of my actions that I'm going to encourage people to think about. On a simpler, less, you know, threatening level, I would say the simple act that Kendi calls out here too, and that's asking why. When we come back to the specific notion of color, right, and colorism and the standards of beauty, etc., but asking ourselves why, both in our own kind of what we try to be from a beauty perspective and why, but also when faced with other people, right? When we look at a picture in a magazine, Henri mentioned this earlier, and we see a picture that we think, oh, that person looks pretty, oh, that person looks good, and we see one that we don't think that's true of. Why is that? What are the qualities about it? And try to be really cognizant of the I hate to say it, but the conditioning, right, that we've all been undergone since the moment we were born, Melissa, like you said, from, you know, not even 2 years old, that poor child being you know, attacked because of her natural hair. But the last act I want to say is and Henri, you talked about this being on the board, and, you know, like you said, like, I know it's a risk, right? You have to take a risk, but the last act for me right now is going to be, we have to take risk. Like, we have to be willing to be the one who says the thing that other people in the room quietly roll their eyes at, or have that thought of, well, there she is, a liberal white woman, or whatever. We have to be willing to do that, because if we're not, we never get anywhere. Right. We just keep talking about it and people just keep dying. So I challenge people and myself, I'm challenging myself to think about, how am I going to take a risk this week that I might not have taken otherwise? Melissa, what are you thinking as far as action? And then Henri, we're going to let you wrap it up.
For me with actions this week, I think it just comes down to, and I think it applies to every group, but I'm going to separate them. For any white listeners, my challenge would be, like you said, is to ask the why, and to actually examine your thoughts and your views. Like, sit with yourself for a little while and really question whether you could have had a president that didn't look like Barack Obama. Because I don't know that we would have had a really dark-skinned black man in office even now. So small stuff that may seem small like that. Examine your views on light versus dark, white versus black, beauty standards, all of that. Because to me, that's being proactive. You know, a lot of times we want to react and we wait until things personally impact us. And we can't do that. We simply have to stop that, because we only want to act. Most of us only want to act when it personally impacts our lives. And people are dying. So we really have to stop that. And for Blacks and people of color, but specifically Black people, take colorism seriously. It's not a joke. It's not a meme. It's not something to giggle about. It is harmful. And I don't think enough of us embrace that it's harmful. Just last night in a room full of people, of my own friends, Black friends, someone said it's always the light-skinned people as a result of something I said. Just last night. So I need us to stop with these phrases and jokes and things that we think are funny because they're not. So I think the last piece for everybody is to do the research, because until you know the history, until you understand why it's so harmful, it's going to continue, because we simply don't understand it. We simply don't get it, and we have to. We just have to.
Yeah. Thank you, Melissa. Appreciate that. Henri, what are you thinking?
Oh man, a lot, but I'm going to be brief. You know, like I said, this has been an interesting week that just brought so many things to bear. And when I juxtapose that against the book, it's been a catharsis for me. You know, something you said made me think about this, Melissa, and I think it's later on towards the end of his book where he admits at any point, different points in my life, I've been a racist and I've been an anti-racist. And part of my catharsis has had to deal with, I have been too. You know, this chapter about colorism really impacted me. And because I'm a person of color and I've dated women on every spectrum of color. And reading this chapter, I really had to think deeply about my choices and how much of my choices was about this indoctrination, the stereotype beliefs versus the circumstances and where I was at the time. And, you know, I kind of buffer that against where I have dated dark women, you know, women darker than me. I've loved them, you know, but at the same token, I also know when I look at women of color, something does happen. You know, I call it the Tarzan syndrome, you know, and this idea of, you know, and I really worked at some point, really looking at Black women, regardless of the color of their skin, as equal. And had to, on some conscious level, undo this idea. And part of it was I was raised that way. You know, as I said, I'm very light-skinned, you know, half my family is white, you know. My grandmother was very clear about what kind of girlfriend you should bring into the house. That was very clear. So I guess I'm just saying we go through this, you know, none of us are immune. I'm probably going through a catharsis and transition now. And it's about challenging yourself, challenging the whys. Why do we think that way? Why do we believe this? And when you can take that opportunity, take a risk to be different.
Yeah, appreciate that, Henri. So we are going to wrap up our conversation this week right there, and we're going to look ahead to next week, of course. Next week, we're going to be at chapter 10, and we're going to go from color to the chapter on white, that Kendi presents to us. And he's gonna lay out an argument for separating the idea of racist power or racist policymaking from white people, and how we do that and how we think about that, which really ties into something you said earlier, Henri. So that's where we're going to go next week. We of course encourage all of you to like and share and subscribe, do all the things, especially the share part. And I'm really, with everything going on in the world, especially the chapters on behavior, especially the chapters on body, etc. I just feel like the more people can hear those conversations, the better. And so we certainly ask all of you to forward that. Of course, I thank Melissa and Henri as always of being part of the conversation. And to everyone else, tune in next week and we'll get to it.